Paul Kolbe is a retired senior CIA officer and former head of the CIA station in Moscow. Welcome to our program, Paul Kolbe.
Hello, Daniel. Nice to be here with you.
A high-ranking Russian general, Igor Kirillov, who was the head of Russia's nuclear and chemical forces, has been killed in Moscow by the Ukrainian security services. Ukraine claims that General Kirillov was a legitimate target as he carried out war crimes. What is your reaction to this development, and what does it mean?
Well, once again, I'm impressed at the operational capability of the services that conducted this operation. It clearly showed precise targeting. It clearly showed deep planning. It showed that there's an apparatus, not only in Moscow, but throughout the country, which can support such special operations. It showed precise execution. So in contrast to Russia's indiscriminate bombing of Ukrainian cities, of hospitals, of kindergartens, of railway stations, to sow terror, this was a precise target focused on an important military target that has both tactical effect in that it took out a most senior Russian official, military official, killed to date behind the lines. It also has a strategic effect in sending a message to leadership in Moscow and to the population of Russia that no one is safe behind the lines that is conducting atrocities and war crimes in Ukraine.
General Igor Kirillov is the most senior officer to be killed since Russia started its illegal invasion of Ukraine, as you mentioned. Does it mean that Russia's counterintelligence has been degrading and is unable to protect even its own most senior commanders?
Well, I think that's obvious just from the results of this operation, but not only this operation, but many others. Going back to the very early days of the war, with the successful bombing of the bridge, the significant continuing nonstop sets of operations behind the lines in occupied territory in Ukraine, but also behind the lines in Russia shows that there's important capability there.
Also, it is interesting that this Russian general was killed by a remote bomb planted into an electric scooter outside his apartment building and 7 kilometers southeast of the Kremlin. What does it say about Ukraine's tactics and intelligence innovations?
You know, for decades we've heard about precision-guided missiles and the high technology that it takes to put a missile precisely on target, limiting collateral damage while at the same time taking out the target. Well, this was a precision-guided scooter. Low tech, but with high capability in terms of very high tech of operational sophistication, operational networks and apparatus, creativity and planning, and precise execution. So the fact that the target and only the targets were taken out with no damage to civilians, no collateral damage, really is impressive. And it shows the difference in the way that Ukraine is fighting the war as opposed to Russia with its indiscriminate attacks.
I would like also to go into the consequences of this operation from a strategic and tactical level. What is your take on the main effects of this operation for Russian elites and for Russian chain of command?
Well, you've heard the shouting and screaming from Russian elites that those that perpetrated this will be found and punished. You've heard by the volume of their commentary and the nature of it, you can see that it was had a shocking effect for them, and I think a sobering one. The strategic effect, look, it's not going to change the course of the war. This official will be replaced by another lackey coming up through the system. But it does send an important message to the leadership that if you're committing war crimes, you're not safe. You're not safe during the war, and then after the war, you're going to be prosecuted. That shows that the Ukrainian services have very good book, very good information on who does who lives where, what their patterns of life are, and where their vulnerabilities are. So it should send a shudder of fear throughout the establishment.
Also, as you just mentioned about new threats from the Russian leadership, Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chairman of the Russian Security Council, urged security services of Russia to eliminate Ukrainian political leadership in response to such an attack on the Russian general. What is your take on that, and do you feel that Russian special services are able to do such, to conduct such operations? Because we have been hearing such threats about the elimination of Ukrainian leadership, about the attack on the decision-making centers in Ukraine for a while. However, Russia for now has failed to to do such a full-scale attack on the Ukrainian leadership.
Well, look, this is absolutely typical. Whenever a message like that needs to be sent, they trot Medvedev out to issue threats against Ukraine, against Europe, against America, against the West. Sometimes he's sober, sometimes he's not, but the language is almost always the same. Look, Russia started the war by trying to eliminate Ukrainian leadership, tried to decapitate the Zelensky administration in their so-called special military operation, which they thought would be over in 3 days. Well, we're going on 3 years now. Ukrainian armed forces and special services have done an incredible job in protecting not only Ukraine, defending its territory, protecting the cities, driving Russia back from territory they had gained, and fighting it to a standstill in some places and decisively defeating it in others. No, of course, efforts to eliminate and to attack leadership, political and military, in Ukraine on the part of Russia is going to continue. But that's not a new theme. That's started at the very beginning of the war.
And do you also expect Russia to try to eliminate President Zelensky? Because there were some attempts in the past, after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, there were some plots against Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who was in Ukrainian capital in Kyiv at the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Look, I would expect that Russia is going to try to do everything it can to achieve its aims, and its aims are quite clearly to so-called denazify Ukraine. Well, that's code for eliminating Ukrainian political leadership.
Also, I'd like to cover current political situation in Ukraine and the United States. Donald Trump says that Zelensky should be ready to make a deal with Russia. Trump's team will try to move forward with and will press to a ceasefire in Ukraine as early as next year. Kit Kellogg, Trump's special envoy on Ukraine and Russia, says that the war in Ukraine should end, can end in the nearest future, in the upcoming months. Do you feel that a ceasefire deal will serve Vladimir Putin's interests?
Look, we don't know yet what any sort of negotiation, what sort of any ceasefire, what the future holds on that. I think it's important to note that Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg is going to be traveling to Kyiv and to Paris and to Berlin. He's not going to Moscow. He's consulting with our friends and allies and the folks that we support in Ukraine. And he says that he's going to be on a listening trip. And I think that's important. He's going to be collecting facts on the ground and listening to the commentary of both Ukrainian leadership and those that support Ukraine. If you look closely at what he's written, he's argued that there should be negotiations. Well, wars end either with capitulation or with negotiations. No one's calling for Ukrainian capitulation. Donald Trump and he are hoping for an early end to the war. I don't think you'll find anybody that's not hoping for an early end to the war. But of course, it has to be on terms that are acceptable to Ukraine. It has to be an end that is with honor, that ensures Ukraine's security, sovereignty, and prosperity going forward. What the outlines of that are, I don't know. But I think that an important part of any negotiation is going into those negotiations with as much leverage as you possibly can. And what that means is strength on the battlefield, growing military capability, political will, all of those which Ukraine has.
From your perspective, what does Vladimir Putin make on this idea of a ceasefire in Ukraine? What does he make of this, and what does his inner circle make of such initiatives?
Well, look, I'm not inside their heads, but look, we know what they've said and we know what they've done. Before the war, they claimed that they had no intention of invading Ukraine, that they were only doing military exercises. They lied literally every time their lips were moving. Lies were coming out of their mouths about this. They tried to deceive the world. When they started the campaign, they said it was for the goals that they set out were to so-called denazify Ukraine. Just the more absurd statement I can hardly imagine, and to demilitarize it. Well, they've completely failed in shaking Ukrainian leadership, which has been stalwart and strong, and they have completely failed in demilitarizing. In fact, they've done just the opposite. Ukraine is stronger, more capable, more determined than it was at the start of the war. I stand in absolute awe of both Ukrainian armed forces, the soldiers in the field, the men and women fighting, the services across government that are supporting them, the people that are supporting them going to work every day and living their lives and raising their children. So, look, Russia has completely failed in its strategic goals of this. The other one was to stop NATO expansion. Well, they've expanded NATO. They now have two of the strongest armies and militaries in Europe, Sweden and Finland, on their border. I believe that Ukraine's future will be in NATO. I don't know the timing of that. It's a complex political problem. But I believe that ultimate security for Ukraine and for Europe and the United States is a Ukraine free and whole and in NATO. What the steps are to get there, don't know. I don't believe that there's any magic solution, but it's completely clear to me that the war, any fighting that stops, must stop in a way that doesn't let Russia simply rest, rearm, regroup, and then resume the fight. It has to be with a set of concrete, practical, implementable, visible security guarantees for Ukraine that keeps Russia, deters Russia from resuming the fight.
And do you feel that Trump and his team understand this idea, this importance of providing Ukraine with security guarantees and of making sure Russia cannot invade Ukraine again in the future?
I believe there's a widespread understanding across the sectors of U.S. government and within Congress of the importance and vitality of Ukraine to U.S. security interests and to security interests of the West as a whole. I think that there needs to be a clearer vision for Ukraine in the minds of Europeans and Americans. And part of that vision, I believe, is a Ukraine that is the most prosperous, most dynamic, fastest growing, and most stalwart member of a Western alliance, defending Western values, defending democracy, and defending our common interests.
Also, there has been lots of intelligence cooperation between CIA and Ukrainian intelligence services after the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Do you expect such cooperation to continue after after the beginning of Trump's term in the White House?
Look, I can't comment on any of that. I don't know the facts, but here's what I do know, that historically, that intelligence services have played an extraordinary role in being able to sustain relationships regardless of political ups and downs. And so because secret services can operate quietly, operate outside of the political limelight, are intensely practically focused, that there's a capability there to support and cooperate and work together in situations that you might find surprising.
And can CIA convince Donald Trump that supporting Ukraine is in the U.S. national interest? Do you expect CIA to play a kind of role in that, in rising awareness?
No, the role of the intelligence community in the United States is to provide intelligence and analysis to political leadership, which then lets them take political decisions. The CIA and the intelligence community does not play a political role and does not play a policy role. And that's a bright red line. It's been extremely important throughout the history of the organization that the agency and the intelligence community writ large provides objective, fact-based intelligence, unbiased assessment to political leadership.
I would like also to cover current Russia's sabotage undercover operations in Europe. There have been some incidents with Russia's drones and Russia's agents regarding the US military presence in Europe, in Germany. And what is your assessment of the current threat posed by Russia to the European states right now?
Look, I think Europe and the United States have been quite slow to wake up to Russian special operations on European territory, and they go back quite far. You can look at the assassination of Alexander Litvinenko in London in 2006, the attempted assassination of Skripal using Novichok chemical weapon. The assassination of Litvinenko used polonium, radioactive weapon. You've seen a long series of sabotage attacks, ammunition plants in Eastern Europe exploding, company officials being targeted for assassination, particularly in the defense industry. You've seen communications and cable lines being cut. Now, recently, you've seen undersea communication lines being cut. So Russia's doing a number of different things with these things. One, they're sending a message of, we know where your vulnerabilities are, and we can attack them. And they're looking for the tactical effect. Look, Russia, for decades, main strategy has been to divide countries amongst each other. They've used energy as a weapon to divide allies. Certainly Ukraine knows that story very well and how it's been used as a pawn in that game. It has used subterfuge and covert support to extremist organizations to support on both sides of the political spectrum to try to increase division within countries, increase political discord. And they've certainly made massive use of social media and misinformation and disinformation to achieve the same effect. So this all weaves together, going back to the beginning of your question, all goes back into a long-running campaign, systematic campaign to undermine democratic foundations of Europe, to split allies apart from each other, and to create fear and uncertainty.
Do you feel that such attacks would reach their goals, reach Russian goals to spread fear among European leaders?
No, not if we don't take counsel of our fears. If we understand the nature of the attacks, if we work assiduously to counter them, if we undertake efforts to deter them as well, and there's many other things that they can do in that regard. No, I don't think we need to fear Russian activities. I think we need to pay attention to them. I think we need to work very hard to counter them, and that requires cooperation between countries and between military and intelligence establishments, and it requires a very, very clear eye about what's happening. I think too long we've looked at all of these as little points of information and not connected them. Like a pointillist painting, we need to step back and look at the big picture of what's happening.
Also, Russia has been threatening to use nuclear weapons since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Do you feel that such threats properly work right now for Western leaders? And do you feel
Well, I
they
think,
are afraid of such threats?
uh, look, no leader wants to risk nuclear war, but I also believe that any country that threatens nuclear war, particularly against the West, the United States, understands very clearly that starting nuclear war will end badly for everyone involved. President Reagan said a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Chinese leader Xi Jinping recently just said the same thing. So the way Russia can use nuclear weapons is to try to use them as a threat. And they keep doing it because I think they feel that they had some impact in deterring deterring more fulsome support for Ukraine than might otherwise have been.
Do you feel that such threats cannot longer be useful to threaten Western leaders, because we are moving closer to the beginning of the fourth year of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and Russia has not yet used the nuclear weapons, tactical or strategic one, against Ukrainian forces or a NATO member countries? Don't you think that such threats no longer could be useful for Russians?
I think they've had diminishing effect, diminishing returns. You know, as they've been uttered again and again and again, they've lost some of their potency, and you see that. In addition, you know, Russia drew many, so-called red lines, all of which have been crossed without that attack. So Ukraine is quite properly defending itself by attacking strategic targets in Russia, oil targets, communication targets, military targets, all those things that are supporting the Russian war effort. That has not resulted in a nuclear strike on Ukraine, nor do I expect it to.
That also covers the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime. Do you feel that this is a sign of the biggest Russia's intelligence failure?
Well, I don't know if it's an intelligence failure, but it's certainly a policy failure. Look, how many billions and billions of rubles did Russia invest in that regime? How much of its prestige did it invest? How many tens of thousands of Syrian civilians did Russian forces kill during the course of supporting that dictator? One of the most horrific in history now is that we see the machinery of its imprisonment, torture, and execution complex, Nazi-era comparisons with that. This was Putin's main friend in the Middle East. He staked a lot of Russian prestige, a lot of Russian military power, and a lot of Russian money on that. What it really shows is how brittle dictatorships are. Dictators can last a long time because of the forces of repression that they use. They can imprison, they can kill, they can torture, they can instill fear in populations. But eventually, dictatorships prove brittle. They can seem strong on the outside, but they're rotten from the inside. And when they collapse very quickly. And we saw that with the Soviet Union as well. The West looked at the Soviet Union and saw a strong monolith. You know, there was very few predictions that the Soviet Union collapsed, but within it was a rotten economy, a rotten society, corrupt, and the people knew it. And so when it unraveled very quickly, and all those constituents of the Soviet Union that weren't Russian ran away from that as fast as they could. So it was no coincidence that the Baltic states, the Ukraine, Central Asian states, all refused to join into a new federation with Russia.
And are there chances that Putin's regime could also collapse as quickly as Bashar al-Assad did sometime in the future? And what are the risks for that? How can you assess current Putin's grip on power?
Yeah, can it happen? Certainly. Is it likely to happen? Who knows? How many people predicted Assad's fall 2 weeks before it happened? Certainly not the Russians, their closest supporters. Israelis didn't expect it to happen, sitting close on the line. So it can be very sudden when these dramatic movements take place. But what are some of the elements that could lead to that? Well, Putin's getting a little bit long in the tooth. He's been in power since 1999. He's been there longer than 5 U.S. presidents. He has a very, very small inner circle of people that he trusts, which means there's a very, very wide circle of people out there, officials, civilians, etc., that he doesn't trust. Who does Russia fear most? Do they fear Ukraine most? No, the Russian services, what is the FSB, for example? What do they focus on most? They focus most on controlling their own population. Tremendous amounts of Russian resources are devoted entirely to subjugating and controlling and manipulating its own population, because that's what they fear most. So I think that's an element there that can't be ignored. Does that mean that popular revolt is suddenly going to erupt in Russia? No, I don't think so. Partly because the services have been so well resourced, so well rewarded, and are quite effective in repressing populations. Dictatorships are good at that. Other element that is important, and you see regimes like this collapse, is external pressure. Syria was under external pressure from a number of angles, and it had critically lost its ability for Hezbollah to support it and for Iran to support it in shoring it up. And when it came time, the Sunni soldiers that were standing at checkpoints on the road to Damascus, they didn't want to fight for Assad. They didn't want to fight for a corrupt regime that they didn't have a stake in. It reminded me a little bit of when we saw Prigozhin on his road march to Moscow, rolling past checkpoint after checkpoint, unit after unit of Russian soldiers standing by, not quite knowing what was going to happen. But they weren't defending Mother Russia at the time. They were waiting to see which way the wind was going to blow. So there's elements of Russia, that I think are symptomatic of the brittleness that you see that can lead to sudden regime collapse.
Thank you, Paul Kolbe, for your time and for supporting Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. Thank you very much.